Have you ever considered that the narrative of betrayal we've all been taught might be fundamentally flawed? What if the very first act of dissent against the divine didn't originate with Lucifer, but with a far more ancient collective of beings who existed in God's presence long before the book of Genesis was ever conceived? Let's entertain a thought. The figure of Lucifer, as we know him, might not be the originator of rebellion. What if he was merely an heir to a pattern of dissent, a legacy of separation that began eons before his infamous uprising? There are ancient scriptures, texts that were omitted from the canonical Bible, that seem to hold the missing pieces to this puzzle. The Book of Enoch, the Book of Jubilees, and the Apocalypse of Abraham allude to primordial entities that were brought into existence even before the earth was formed. They weren't angels, nor were they demons. They occupied a space somewhere in between. And when the Creator unveiled the grand design for humanity, these beings didn't clench their fists in anger or rise up in a furious revolt. Their response was far more chilling. They simply withdrew, their silence steeped in a quiet contempt. Can you picture it? The sheer volume of their silent rejection would have been more profound than any battle cry. These entities, older than the angels and endowed with complete consciousness, viewed mankind as little more than animated dust, flawed, unworthy, and profoundly beneath the divine. So instead of participating in this new chapter of creation, they turned their backs and walked away. It wasn't a cataclysmic fall from grace. It wasn't a war. It was a refusal, a withdrawal from the unfolding plan of God. Some ancient traditions refer to this event as the separation of the firstborn. Others describe it as the moment heaven first lost its intrinsic unity. Lucifer's rebellion was a later development, but he didn't pioneer betrayal. He inherited it. What could have possibly motivated these beings to make such a profound choice? Why did they turn away from the Creator's vision for humankind? Is it possible that their silent rejection was the true genesis of the cosmic conflict between the heavens and the earth? The Bible may not offer all the specifics, but these forgotten texts, the ones left on the cutting room floor, hint at a much deeper, buried truth. If you feel a pull to explore the hidden narratives behind this first betrayal, just comment with the number 777. The story of who these beings were and how their silent dissent may have shaped the destiny of everything that followed is about to be revealed. Stay with me. We are only just beginning. The first to turn from God, long before Genesis, was not Lucifer. Before the ink of Genesis had dried, before the cosmos was adorned with stars or the angelic hosts were called into being, there was a form of creation that few have ever heard of. It was not made of flesh, nor was its spirit in the way we comprehend it. These were the initial emanations, ancient presences born from light itself, yet not bound by the divine order that governs the heavens. According to fragmented texts preserved in the forgotten archives of Enoch, whispered through the mystical teachings of the Zohar, and concealed within the depths of the Cairo Geniza, these beings were the primordials. They were not servants, soldiers, or even messengers. They were pure consciousness, untamed will, and brilliant intellect, existing like a flame without fire, a presence without a physical form. Have you ever contemplated what it would mean to exist before the concept of obedience was even formed? Imagine a creation that understood no command, only the state of being. The primordials were not created to kneel. They were light without direction, thought without a task, awareness born before any law was established. Certain ancient scriptures describe them as divine sparks granted full autonomy by the Eternal One, perhaps as a test of their purity, or maybe as the untamed echo of God's first creative breath. They did not bow because they had never been asked to. They simply existed. But then a monumental shift occurred. God, in the infinite expanse of his purpose, revealed something utterly radical, a new creation, not of light, but of humble dust, not an emanation, but matter, and not just animated clay, but a being fashioned in his very own image. That single revelation sent a crack through the fabric of the cosmos. The primordials, who had never known a hierarchy, suddenly witnessed a form that was more favored than they were, not superior in essence, but chosen by divine decree. From dust, some whispered among themselves, and in his likeness. Can you sense the profound tension of that moment? If you were one of them, wouldn't you have questioned it too? An ancient midrash offers a glimpse into this enigma, describing a celestial assembly where divine consciousnesses debated the creation of man. Voices, if such things could exist among the formless, issued warnings, let this creature not be made. He will rebel, he will surely fall. They foresaw what was to come, the betrayals, the violence, the pride. Yet God, with unwavering clarity, created Adam anyway. He didn't seek their consensus. He simply acted. And when he did, something unprecedented took place. Not a war in heaven, not a mutiny, but a silent refusal, a withdrawal. The primordials didn't utter curses or raise their hands in violence. They simply took a step back. In a quiet act of defiance, they disengaged themselves from the divine alignment. There was no storm, no celestial fire, just an invisible rift, a fracture in the cosmic intention. Have you ever walked away from something, not out of hatred, but because you could no longer reconcile it with your own being? What if they weren't rebelling, but grieving? Jewish mystics would later label this moment as the breaking of the intention. Others would call these beings the blind watchers or the forgotten line, not because they lacked sight, but because they chose to turn away from the light in a solemn protest filled not with rage, but with sorrow. Kabbalistic texts suggest they were sealed away, not punished, but paused, confined to dimensions where time is frozen, where even divine glory dares not penetrate. They are not fallen, not condemned, just absent. And so the question lingers. If they were the first to turn away, before Lucifer, before Eden, and before sin even had a name, what does their story signify for us? Would you have stood with God, or would you have stepped back in silence? Among the ancient scrolls found in the caves near Qumran, the Dead Sea Scrolls, there are delicate fragments that few scholars dare to examine too closely. These writings speak of spirits who exist not in torment or rebellion, but in a profound stillness. They are beings who once stood so close to the divine presence that they shimmered with its reflection, yet now they observe from a great distance. They were not cast down or condemned. They are simply disconnected. Their essence persists, but something fundamental is gone, like stars that once burned with incredible glory but chose to extinguish their own light. Have you ever witnessed a light that refuses to shine? Can you imagine a presence so immensely powerful, yet so utterly silent? These spirits are not demons. They have no interest in tempting or deceiving anyone, but they are not whole. Their silence was not a passive act. It carried the immense weight of a decision, a cosmic precedent. When they turned inward and away, heaven itself felt the tremor. Theirs was the first choice not to follow, not to submit, not to rebel, but simply to step aside. And in doing so, they created a space for something no creation had ever attempted before, disobedience without defiance. Lucifer's rebellion would later shake the heavens like a clap of thunder, but the primordials, they moved like shadows, their departure almost unnoticed. And that is precisely what makes their story so unsettling. They proved a terrifying truth. Betrayal doesn't always require a sword. Sometimes all it takes is silence, a whisper, a subtle shift of alignment. If heaven could be fractured by a quiet turning away, if glory itself could be diminished not by hatred, but by hesitation, what does that reveal about our own nature? Have we completely misunderstood what betrayal really is? Could it begin not with a shout of rage, but with a simple pause? God was not overthrown, his throne was never in jeopardy, but he was abandoned. The first pain experienced in heaven was not a battle cry, it was the silent, aching wound of rejection. No angels plummeted from the skies, no flames erupted. There was only that invisible severing, a quiet parting of ways by those who had once stood closest to the throne of light. It wasn't an act of violence. It was the absence of communion. And that absence, that profound silence, cut deeper than any war ever could. Can you feel the ache of a creator whose own emanations chose distance over devotion? Jewish mystics described this unfathomable moment with a phrase rarely spoken aloud, Olam nittel me'elohim. Their light was taken from them by God, but not their existence. They weren't annihilated. They were preserved but dimmed, like sacred lamps unplugged from their source of power. Their flame still flickers, but only faintly, hidden away in places where the divine glory no longer reaches. This wasn't a punishment, it was a sorrow. They weren't judged, they were mourned. And now you must ask yourself, if the first betrayal of God wasn't rebellion, but withdrawal, how many of us today walk that very same path without even realizing it? Have you, too, ever stood so close to the light, only to find yourself slowly drifting away? For the first time in an eternity that had been untouched by conflict or distance, the Creator stood before a creation that no longer desired him. This was not born of rebellion or rage, but of a quiet, devastating refusal. That moment, though completely wordless, marked the first rupture in the seamless flow of divine love. It was a fracture not in power, but in intimacy. Until then, heaven had only known presence and response, glory answering glory. But now, something entirely new had entered the divine narrative, a creation that turned away. An ancient commentary vividly captures the tremor that followed. The angels, beings forged in perfect obedience, asked the question that resonated through the heavenly courts. Why would you create man who will only sin? And God, with a resolve that sent a chill through the cosmos, answered simply, even so I will make him. But the scrolls remain silent on the deeper truth whispered between the lines, the unspoken ache behind God's words. He did not create man in spite of that first abandonment. He created man because of it. Can you imagine a creator whose heart responds to rejection not with wrath, but with an even greater risk? The primordials, those first emanations, departed because they refused to serve what they deemed beneath them. Dust, they declared, was not worthy of bearing the image of the Most High. How could the Eternal One possibly wrap his likeness in weakness and decay? They would not stoop to serve such fragility, and in their prideful withdrawal, they believed they had ended the story. But God leaned into that very rejection. He didn't retreat, he expanded. He didn't scrap the plan, he deepened it. He shaped man not as a replacement, but as a sacred gamble. What if the next creation could choose to love, not from instinct or proximity to glory, but from a place of longing, trust, and the quiet stillness of faith? Have you ever chosen someone when every part of you feared they might leave? Can love truly be pure if it isn't guaranteed? God desired a creation that could believe in him without seeing him, that could love him without being bathed in eternal light. A creation that might walk through pain, doubt, and shadows and still turn back to say, I trust you. He wanted a devotion born not from command, but from freedom. And that desire gave birth not just to humanity, but to the entire mystery of Eden. Eden was never just a garden. It was God's answer to heartbreak. The first heartbreak in heaven wasn't caused by Lucifer. It began long before with beings who simply walked away. But God's response was not to destroy. It was to create again, this time with risk embedded in the very design, the risk of love without sight, the chance that someone, perhaps you, might choose to stay even when you have every reason to leave. Have you ever felt like your very existence is part of a much larger healing? What if you were born to be the response to a wound that no one on earth remembers, but heaven has never forgotten? And that is why the silence of those first traitors still lingers, because even though they stepped away, they continue to watch from the edges of eternity. In places where the light no longer reaches, something ancient observes. Still there, still silent, still judging. The first ones to turn away are now watching to see if you will do the same. Will you? And among those ancient ones, those who had quietly turned away, there was one who refused to remain in the shadows. He would not simply withdraw, he would rise. Unlike the others who faded into stillness, he burned with a restless fire. Lucifer, the light-bearer, had observed what the primordials had done in silence, but he would not follow their lead. Where they receded into the distance, he stepped forward, not with humility, but with open defiance. He transformed their passive retreat into a calculated confrontation. They had withdrawn in quiet protest, but he would give voice to what they only dared to feel. What could possibly drive a being of light to turn silence into a strategy? Have you ever been so thoroughly convinced of your own righteousness that you challenged the very order that brought you into being? Lucifer wasn't the first to question God's design, but he was the first to weaponize that doubt. The Book of Enoch refers to him as the son of the morning, not just for his brilliance, but for what he remembered. He had witnessed that first fracture. He had seen the pain in God's eyes when his creation stepped away. And deep within him, a conviction took root, not that man was holy, but that man was a mistake. He looked upon humanity not with wonder, but with suspicion, not as the image of the divine, but as a flaw carved into the sacred order. Lucifer's fall, contrary to popular belief, was not the result of a single fleeting moment of pride. It was the culmination of a long and escalating disagreement with the very blueprint of creation. He didn't reject a command, he rejected the entire plan. In a rare and cryptic passage from the Apocalypse of Abraham, it speaks of a shining one who stood before God and argued, should the throne not belong to those born of flame rather than of clay? This wasn't a rebellion born in darkness. It was a courtroom challenge. He didn't sneak or deceive, at least not at first. He approached the throne as a prosecutor. He saw himself not as an enemy, but as a guardian of cosmic order. The Zohar hints that Lucifer believed he was preserving holiness, convinced that it was man, this vulnerable and fallible being, who would bring contamination to the eternal realms. In his own mind, the cosmos needed defending from what he perceived as divine vulnerability. He wasn't rebelling against God out of hatred. He believed he was helping God by opposing something he could not accept. But in trying to preserve what he thought was pure, Lucifer created the darkest distortion of all. Have you ever tried to fix something, only to end up destroying it in the process? He turned the wound of heaven into an accusation. The quiet heartbreak of divine abandonment became the foundation for his revolt. He gave a voice to the silence the primordials had left behind. Where they had walked away, he stood and shouted. Where they had rejected gently, he tore through the heavens with fury. And for the first time since eternity began, heaven shook, not from distance, but from force. Not because someone left, but because someone tried to seize the center. But even in his rebellion, Lucifer was not original. He was responding to an ache he could never make peace with, a silence he could not accept. And when he fell, he did not fall alone. Have you ever considered who might be watching in silence, just waiting for someone bold enough to speak their own hidden doubts? Behind Lucifer followed not armies of fire, but the whispers of an old grievance, not warriors, but watchers, beings who had never raised a hand but had once refused to serve. And when they saw him rise, they recognized the echo of their own descent. They saw the old debate returning, not about power, but about purpose. God was creating again not more light but breath, not a radiant being but a fragile one, a creature of blood, dust, and longing, and not in the likeness of angels but in the likeness of God himself. And so the watchers watched once more, silent, solemn, and uncertain. What would you have done, standing there in eternity's court? Would you have defended God's choice, or would you have seen only the risk? This time there would be no heavenly debate, no gathering of divine minds, no vote cast in celestial courts. The heavens, once consulted on creation's earliest decisions, now stood in silence. Genesis records it with stark simplicity, "Let us make man in our image." But the ancient texts, those preserved in Midrash, the Zohar, and mystic scrolls, reveal so much more. According to Midrash Tehillim, the angels cried out in protest as God began to shape Adam. They could not contain their confusion. "What is man that you are mindful of him?" they asked, echoing the cry of Psalm 8. How could mere dust deserve such divine attention? How could the Eternal stoop so low? But God did not flinch. He offered no explanation. He offered intention. The Zohar tells us that Adam was crafted from both the loneliness of dust and the breath of divine fire, a mixture so paradoxical it disarmed his accusers. Why? Because it created a being who could fall to great depths, yet rise even higher. A creature not limited by proximity to glory like the angels. One who would not serve out of reflex or radiant compulsion, but from choice, from longing, from love. Have you ever loved without a guarantee, followed without seeing, or trusted without proof? That is what man was designed to do, and that made him not only dangerous, but revolutionary. He was not made to simply echo heaven, but to challenge it, to remind all who had walked away that God still believed in the power of risk. According to certain Kabbalistic traditions, Adam's creation wasn't just a beautiful act of love. It was an act of war, a divine strike against the pride of the primordials. It was a holy declaration that dust, the very thing they had rejected, could now carry the glory that light had refused. Can you imagine how heaven trembled, not at a rebellion but at a birth? Man was not heaven's servant. He was its answer, a response to the silence, to the distance, to that cold severing that occurred long before Eden's gates ever opened. Not a puppet, but a partner, not made to praise blindly, but to seek the face of God and decide for himself whether to follow. And that freedom, in all its raw, terrible beauty, made Eden far more than just a garden. Eden became a battlefield, not of swords, but of ideologies. It was a sacred proving ground where heaven's oldest wounds were forced into the light. It was there that divine love met ancestral bitterness. There that a new creation stood where the first ones had refused to stand. And right at the center of it all, without even knowing it, stood Adam, flesh and breath, soil and spirit. A living contradiction placed directly in the crossfire of an invisible war he did not start, but was destined to carry. Have you ever stepped into a battle you didn't choose, simply by being who you are? Adam was not just the beginning of mankind. He was the definitive statement that God had not given up, that he had dared, despite abandonment, to begin again, to entrust his image to weakness, to wrap his likeness in limitation. And that act, so bold and defiant, was an insult to those who had turned away, for they had once stood in undimmed glory, only to now see that glory handed to clay. And perhaps the question still lingers in the silence they left behind. If God would give such honor to dust, then what might he still be willing to do with you? Genesis chapter 3 opens not with a warning or a clap of thunder, but with a voice already speaking. The serpent doesn't slither into the scene with dramatic fanfare. There is no grand entrance. He is simply there, and his first words to Eve are deceptively casual. Did God really say? But make no mistake, this was not a question born of curiosity. It was a calculated tactic, a seed of doubt disguised as a simple conversation. From the very beginning, the serpent doesn't attack the command itself. He targets something far more fragile, more sacred. He goes after the relationship, the bond between Eve and God, the unspoken trust between Eve and Adam, the invisible thread tying humanity to divine truth. Have you ever had someone ask you a question, not to find an answer, but to make you doubt what you already knew? What most readers miss is subtle yet devastating. The serpent's opening line was not a lie, not yet. It was a distortion, a slight shift, a manipulation of the framing, and in that subtle twist, he created just enough room for confusion to enter. Scripture tells us in Genesis 2:17 that God gave the command not to eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil directly to Adam. Eve had not yet been created. She received this truth secondhand through Adam's voice, not God's, and Lucifer, ancient and cunning, was keenly aware of this. So he didn't need to argue with God. He just needed to insert a question mark into Eve's trust. According to early Jewish midrashim, Eve added a line to God's original instruction when she replied to the serpent, "We must not eat it, nor even touch it." But God had never said they couldn't touch the tree. That small addition, a subtle overcorrection, revealed something deeper, that the seed of distortion had already taken root. Why did the serpent approach Eve? Why not challenge Adam directly? Some ancient writings, including mystical threads from the Zohar, suggest it wasn't because Eve was weaker, but because she was different. She represented something Adam did not: intuition, receptivity, an echo of spiritual sensitivity. She was not the lesser vessel, she was the mirror. And in that mirror, Lucifer saw an opportunity not to break the woman, but to shift the entire foundation of mankind through the one who perceived things more deeply. Can you see how powerful that insight is? If you were Lucifer, would you not aim for the very structure through which the divine design flowed? And that is why it worked. Not through force, not with flames or fangs, but through conversation, through the careful shaping of perception. Eve was not seduced in the way tradition often misrepresents. She was convinced. She reached for what she believed was wisdom. She acted not with rebellion, but with reasoning, and that is what made the outcome so devastatingly effective. She reached, she touched, she tasted, and then she handed the fruit to Adam. And what happened next, he did not question. He did not hesitate. He took it and ate. In that moment, the fracture that had once begun in heaven now echoed in the garden. Lucifer's strategy was never about brute destruction. It was about infiltration, a reworking of the blueprint from the inside out. He didn't need to fight man with war, he needed man to dismantle himself. And he began not with rage, but with a suggestion. And Eve, completely unaware, stepped into a conflict that had been smoldering long before she ever drew breath. She didn't cause it, but her choice became the hinge upon which all of history would swing. Have you ever felt like you inherited a war you didn't start, and yet your decision became the turning point? This was not just the fall of man. It was the continuation of an ancient tension between divine design and celestial descent. And now that conflict lived in flesh and breath and consequence. The silence that once fractured heaven did not remain there. It echoed, soft but unrelenting, into the very fabric of the earth. And when Adam and Eve stood beneath the trembling branches of Eden's forbidden tree, they stepped into a silence older than time itself. But unlike the first fracture, this one would not end in separation alone. Because even before the first breath of dust became life, the Creator had already written the answer into the very fabric of reality, not a plan for punishment, but a path for repair. Some ancient texts, buried in mystical commentaries and seldom-read scrolls, suggest that this world was never intended to be perfect, at least not in the sense of being flawless. Its perfection lay in its purpose. Earth was designed as a place of restoration, a realm created not just to house mankind, but to heal the breach left by that first turning away. It was a second chance, not only for humanity, but perhaps even for the divine design itself. Have you ever wondered if creation itself is a response to a heartbreak that no one remembers? This was never about domination or blind obedience. The true power of humanity was never in its perfection but in its choice. Existence became a divine invitation, not to serve as slaves, but to return as sons and daughters, not to earn favor, but to rediscover alignment. Every breath you take, every moment that time moves forward, is a quiet reminder that this invitation still stands. It has never been revoked. And now, across ages of silence and shadows, a question remains, one that still pulses beneath scripture and myth. If the first betrayal occurred before Genesis, then who were they? Who were those immortals that turned from the light, not in war but in quiet refusal? Were they silent rebels, too proud to bend? Were they watchers, assigned to observe but never to act? Were they a forgotten lineage, lost to time but not to consequence? What do you think? And so, long before the fall in Eden, before the fruit was ever touched or the serpent spoke its first words, the true fracture had already begun. Not in defiance, but in silence. Not through violence, but through the simple act of walking away. And from that ancient turning, a divine question has echoed across the ages. What will you do when you are given the freedom to choose? This story isn't just about forgotten beings in celestial realms. It's about us. It's about every moment when we feel the pull to step back from faith, from purpose, from truth. In your own life, how many times have you felt the weight of that silence? The temptation not to rebel, but simply to withdraw, to disconnect. This ancient story lives on in our daily choices, in our struggles to trust what we cannot see, to love even when it costs us something, to stay when leaving seems so much easier. But here is the hope. God didn't abandon his creation after betrayal. He created again. He didn't erase the story, he deepened it. And that means your failures are not the end. They are the soil for something new to grow. You are not called to be perfect. You are called to choose, to return, to rise, to become the answer to those who walked away. If this message stirred something in your spirit, don't keep it to yourself. Consider sharing it with someone who needs to hear it, and follow our channel so you won't miss what's coming next. We also invite you to comment below. What are your thoughts on these forgotten beings? Do you feel that humanity was created in response to an ancient betrayal? We would love to read your perspective. Just type 777 if you feel ready to return to the light and walk boldly in your divine purpose. And to those who have supported this channel through super thanks, your kindness fuels everything we do. Whether you give or not, thank you from the bottom of our hearts for being part of this journey. May you walk forward with courage. May you never forget who you are, and may the God who created you from dust breathe new life into your destiny. Blessings upon you and your household always. We'll see you in the next video.